hear about drug companies coming up with a new drug, and then about 5 years later, Consumer Reports says, well, the old drug was as good as or better than the new one. Now, somehow that seems to me inefficient, and is there any statistical way or any way to not have this sort of situation?
It's hard. I mean, I think, you know, the couple of comments there is that, you know, we tend to think drugs simply as efficacy versus non-efficacy or side effects versus not side effects, but it's really more complicated, right? Drug A may be no more efficacious than drug B, but have fewer side effects. It's a great drug then. Drug A may be no more efficacious and have no better safety profile, but it can be administered once every 6 months versus everyday tablet. That's a great benefit. So some of those situations are not as clear-cut as is sometimes portrayed. It's drug A didn't work better than drug B. Well, there were other reasons to try it. And clinicians, physicians in particular, often recognize that those are problems that are very important that need to be resolved even if the outcome is equally equivalent. So I'd start by saying that, you know, some drugs are actually useful and good. They just don't get that, they're not efficacious. Now, there are many that come out, this will change the world, and 5 years later, to your point, are doing no better than standard of care. You know, this is, it's not a perfect world. And let me give an example here. Just before I moved into this area, I worked in aerospace. Before I decided to leave aerospace and work in medicine. In aerospace, it was great. You sole sourced a piece of metal that went in the wing. You knew exactly where it was coming from. You knew its mechanical characteristics. You knew the loads that were going to be on it. Even then, you didn't know exactly how a fracture would propagate. So what do you do in there? You actually drill little holes. And the fracture propagates right along the line on those little holes. And when you get to hole 3, you know you need to change that plate. I don't think any one of us wants holes in us that can tell us exactly where things are going wrong and then get us back. So medicine is it's not yet, the individual person is not so well understood. And that's part of the reason why all this cascade of events happen afterwards.
I have 2 questions. One, I have a little difficulty with the randomization process. First of all, let's say an oncological drug. So first of all, the persons that you test on have to have cancer. Then the cancer spreads out anywhere from a little local one to people that are terminal. So in all these things, how do you do the randomization and what?
Okay, so that's a good question. I mean, so you do not want to give somebody who has cancer and is dying a placebo, for example, right? I mean, to your point. So often what you do in oncology, what is often done, in many cases done, is you will start with the trial which treats it as a 3rd line or 4th line therapy. So you'll say, you've used all the standard therapies that are available. None of them have worked. So now let me do it in a placebo versus drug setting, because now it becomes ethical, because I have nothing in my armamentarium to actually try that I know works. So often people will do studies in that circumstance first. In many cases, they won't even be placebo-controlled. They just are considered 4th line therapy. And then if they show success there, they may do it against the 3rd line therapy, then against the 2nd line therapy, and against the 1st line, and slowly migrate their way up the cascade. So that's often how it's done in life-threatening situations, because it is unethical, right, to use a placebo control to randomize in that circumstance.
My second question is, you talked about electronics and mainly as a data collection. My question is, I know that there are pretty good simulation models for many of the biological processes. My question, where do you see the place for computer simulations because there you can do in a milliseconds what takes about 2 years in real life.
Sure.
And
actually,
so where do you see that taking place?
I think it's being used a lot already, and I think the field is actually in its infancy. I think there's a huge role for computer simulations in the design of drugs and doing all in that, really in that first stage. That first stage when you're going from 10,000 odd cases that you know you've identified, you can do a lot of simulations of biological entities. The field, I mean, is still developing rapidly in that area. So all the large pharma companies are already doing it, and they want to do it more and more. So if they have ideas in that area, those are great areas to focus on. Word of caution, human beings are complex people, and so when you go from a simulation to saying, if I'm gaining 2 pounds with the medicine, I might take it every alternate day instead of every day. And that might mess up your simulation. So the human psyche has to be thought through, and this is why clinical trials are complex and difficult and often reflect a mix of science and human reality versus pure science itself, if you will, or a pure experiment, if you will.
Thank you.
You talked about the registry of clinical trials. It's my understanding that many trials, especially those run by manufacturers, they never register them, and they only release the results to the public if they're positive. They keep the other ones in their pocket, and many researchers have to sign a confidentiality agreement not to disclose the results unless the person paying for it agrees. How do we get around that?
That's a great point. So first of all, most people are starting to put the trials in the registry. Now, the government and others are starting to insist if you put the trials in the registry, you have to release the results, and then they don't put them in the registry, to your point. And many investigators do have to sign non-disclosure agreements. And that was one of the things that I highlighted. It is a fundamental problem. And it's one of the things that, for example, Dr. Chas Bhutra is really, the story that I presented that he lived through is just a perfect reminder of how it was a waste of hours of brilliant scientists and billions of dollars going down the tube when we could have been working on something far more important, like Alzheimer's, instead of that at that point. So I think there's a lot of pressure coming on from academicians. Universities have gotten really strict about it. If you go and do a university site now, they will reserve the right to publish, and more of them are asking to do that. So I think that's where the focus is going to come from, because they need those professors, they need those physicians. Those are the people they need to really review their trials and be part of them. And so they're the ones who are exerting the pressure and are actually starting to show some success. So we're not there yet, but we just have to keep at it. And until then, it's an unfortunate and a very, very unfortunate inefficiency of the system right now.
Yeah, I was going to ask essentially the same question, but focusing more on phase 2 and phase 3 trials. So let me ask a follow-up question, which is the patient-centered trial that you were talking about seems to fly directly in the face of the concerns that were just expressed by the last questioner, because you're not going to have the same level of academic supervision, seemingly, that you would have. Like if you're doing a trial at Stanford, you're going to get one level of supervision. If you're doing it with 1,200 people spread across the country, that seems you're going to have a lesser degree of academic supervision. And the second thing is a lot of companies are doing their trials offshore, or they're contracting them out to organizations as like a buffer. You can go to a research organization or a clinical research organization, get the trial done that way. So it seems as if we were really concerned about this problem of getting all the data out there once a trial is being undertaken, it's not just a cost concern, but it's also a safety concern. So why aren't we like going to the FDA? Why isn't the FDA taking the lead on this? Why isn't Congress taking the lead on this and just getting requirements that the data, if you're going to do a trial on human subjects, you have to publish it regardless of whether it's beneficial or detrimental for your company? Why do we accept a lesser standard?
Yeah, no. So a couple of things. One is the largest growth in clinical trials is happening outside the U.S. So, for example, even trials where the drug is going to be approved in the U.S., more and more of the patients in that trial are not in the U.S. They may be anywhere in the world. In fact, and more of them, to your point, are outsourced to clinical or research organizations that take the whole responsibility for the trial. I mean, there is some good news. I mean, yes, the electronics electronic data can be fudged, but it's a lot harder to do it than paper data. So there's a degree of rigor starting to come into it. I can only agree with you that we need to continually apply pressure on getting the FDA to start releasing more and more of that data, and they are. But right now, there isn't a law. There isn't a condition. People have to do it voluntarily. In the U.S., once you're approved, they've gotten much stricter about off-label marketing versus on-label. But you're allowed to prescribe off-label. In Europe, it's a little harder. You tend to not prescribe off-label. So the data you get is a lot more reflective of what you started doing. So here in the U.S., it becomes very difficult. What you're dependent on afterwards is a number of independent investigators running studies, which is what usually happens. Running studies and then either contradicting or agreeing with the results of the trials. And it takes another 5 to 10 years, as per a question that came about earlier, before you really learn that it was or was not as effective as people thought it was. And that's what it is right now. It's not the best world, I agree.
2 short questions. Number one, how often after a drug is, or a device is approved and goes into use, are there big surprises? And the second question is, who does the trials?
Beg your pardon?
Who does the trials? Are they always done in-house by the person who invented the idea, or is there a whole cadre of companies that will do trials for others? Is it a business?
It's a business. I mean, the contract research organization or clinical research organization is which helps. So somebody comes up, usually a group of people come up with the core molecule or target that they want to go after. It takes many hundreds of people to get it to clinical trial human studying. At that point, there's usually a couple of medical directors who are in charge of the trial. Most of the work of conducting the trial today is outsourced to research organizations that do it. It's a $70 to $80 billion a year business, so not a small business by any stretch. And there are very large entities in that area that are playing that role. So the pharmaceutical companies at this point, to a large extent, are sales and distribution groups. A lot of the early research is often done in small biotech startups that are then acquired, and then they oversee the clinical trial with these organizations helping them, and then they often do the sales and marketing if successful, and the regulatory part of interaction with the FDA. And in terms of your first question, how often? It's not uncommon. I mean, for medical devices, it's definitely not uncommon to find that the device either doesn't perform or has side effects that nobody could have predicted from the 200-patient clinical study that was done, if done at all. I mean, just a note on that, medical devices 10 years ago used to often get approved without any clinical study. Yeah, there's a pathway called the 510K, which used to be, a spine implant used to be with no clinical study, could get approved. And there is a place online, I mean, on the FDA.gov website where you can, if you're about to get an implant and your doctor said you should ask him what the brand is, you can go and look up all the adverse events. And it's called I think it's called the MAUDE database, I have to confirm that, but you can go and look at all the adverse events for that specific implant. If I were having one in me, I would definitely go and do that before I get it put in me. So,
Thank you.
My understanding is SRI has not been very active in human trials in the past. However, there is what's going on in Michigan, phase 1. And I'm just wondering if you'd be willing to share your understanding of the vision of the biosciences division in the area of future human trials.
I've only been here a few months, so I'm probably going to I know what's going on, but I will probably not give it due justice. But yes, SRI does have a phase 1 unit in Michigan, and it is conducting phase 1 studies there, and it is now much more active in the area of human clinical studies. That's about as much as I could say there. If somebody else here wants to.
website, we have a press release about it, if you could check out. But yeah, there's anybody in biosciences here who wants to speak afterwards, you have.
Is the press release out, or is it on the web?
It came out a while ago, yeah.
Is it on the website?
Yes, on SRI.com.
Yeah, sure.
Phase 1 clinical trial.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, thank you.
There was a recent book that came out, name escapes me now, but it was discussing animal health, what veterinarians do every day versus what doctors do every day, and the common themes that run through those. So basically every cancer that humans have, you can find animals that have those kinds of cancers. Your whole list that you put up there earlier, you can find in animals. Do you ever see the day where we kind of work together a little bit more in those areas and figure out the cure for the animal, and possibly that will relate to the cure for the human?
I mean, there's already work that takes place in that front. I mean, many of the drugs that are developed for humans are used in animals. Unfortunately, there's a lot of trial and error that takes place in that circumstance, because you don't know the distribution that well, you don't know the dosages that well, so vets have to figure it out. And there are some studies that take place, and there's nowhere near as much of the rigorous studies that take place here. So that's the current method. And actually, that applies, by the way, not just to animals. It often applies to children and humans too, where you're given estimated doses of drugs without knowing exactly what the right dose is. And because the market is smaller, so the amount of money that's being spent on the trial is often much less. And so that's the driver in this circumstance is often the money involved, the outcome involved versus the investment in there. So do I see a day where it gets closer? Yes. I see a day where it becomes easier and easier to get a more biological profile of an individual or an animal via genetics. It's already under $1,000, and if it gets to 50 to 100 to 200 or 500, I can see that there are being easier ways to use the big data approaches and now start applying them. And there's a company in there to do that for animals and try and collate that same data set and build that information to be able to provide those services. It's actually a great idea.
I have two questions. What were your findings from your study of overactive bladder, and did you come up with any new treatments? The second question is it still the case that if the FDA has approved a drug or a procedure, and that a company who uses that drug and procedure as recommended can't be sued, even if adverse events occur?
Okay. So the overactive bladder, we tested a drug that was already approved, so we didn't find a new treatment for it, and it worked the way it was supposed to work. So it wasn't great, is the quick answer. I don't think any of the treatments are absolutely terrific right now, and I don't think that was any better than it was purported to be. I mean, when it causes a 10% improvement, that's not really changing anybody's world in a tremendous way. And so that's my comment there. Regarding the second, I know what you're talking about. I don't know the answer specifically legally about whether it is. I mean, companies do get sued, and but it is a long and tortuous pathway to an end. It doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen even a year. I mean, Vioxx was a perfect example of where it took many, many years before it went from an identification that this is a really big problem to, the response by Merck in that particular instance in resolving those issues. And at the end of the day, there were a lot of lawsuits against Merck, but most of the vast majority of those were settled in any case. So can there be lawsuits? You can sue anybody, but do you have a lot of protection on your side if you get approval? Yes, you do.
In your introduction tonight, it was mentioned that you're now part of SRI's robotics program.
Right.
I'm wondering if there's an intersection with the subject at hand in robotics, or whether
Sure, yeah.
Could you
yeah.
elaborate? Okay.
Yeah. So the robotics group here originally did a lot of medical device work too. So it's really a robotics and systems group here. So they had a number of medical devices. We're also on the robotics side doing a lot of very interesting work, both in the area of surgery, which we originally, Intuitive Surgical spun out of SRI 20 years ago from the robotics group at that time. So there's a long history of surgical robotics and other healthcare-related robotics at SRI. So we're building on that. And the other area that I'm spending a lot of time focusing on is what I love and I think is revolutionary is the area of home healthcare robotics. And there is a need, and we're all growing older, and there's a need, and everywhere from a need in the assisted living care facility to the need in your home. And maybe we'll come up with Robot and Frank someday pretty soon, but I think we're not that far away. I mean, a lot of the work in the robotics group has been focused on non-healthcare related issues, but what they have very successfully done is lowered the cost of building a lot of these robots. So an arm that used to cost $100,000 5 years ago can be built for $1,000 or $500 now. So now you can build an arm, okay, now you can afford to build it because it costs the same as your oven. Now let's start talking about what we can do with it, right? So this is why when I came here, I had worked in medical devices a lot. They needed help in the medical devices side, but I saw what was happening on the robotics side and saw the impact on healthcare. And I was delighted to be asked to become here because I could see the potential of what we can do here.
I'm not sure of the relationship of the two fields. There's a strong constraint on this with regard to human involvement in testing. But in animal husbandry, I see much less of a restraint. In fact, strong economic forces against any involvement of supervision and some larger consideration, with the major question to my mind being antibiotics in the field of animal husbandry.
Sorry, I didn't actually understand. Could you?
The question is, there's strong constraints on human testing, but there aren't similar constraints on animal husbandry, and there seems to be counterforces against any government involvement in supervising this aspect.
That's true. It's true, and this goes line in line with the comment earlier about the veterinarians. I mean, there isn't necessarily the same rigor or approach being applied to human testing is not applied to animal testing or animal husbandry or antibiotics, and part of it is related to the economic drivers. Part of it is related to just the history of the way the FDA came about that I showed. There hasn't been a similar entity for spending that much time on the animal side, and that's where it's at, unfortunately. Thank you very much.